It was mid-morning when Osrith was awakened by a door opening and closing. She tried to blink, but her eyes weren't having any of it, and she rolled over, taking the covers with her. A clink made her turn back over, and she saw Elasade, the fortress's elderly servant, turn back from the food she had brought to her and had sat down on Constantine's writing desk. Realizing she was unclothed, Osrith sat up, bringing the covers with her. Elasade smiled, and gestured towards more clothing that she had brought with her: folded shirt, jerkin beside breeches. Osrith's own boots were beside them and her belt, on which hung tagged Sikhs and buoy. "Thank you for looking after Edra for me," Osrith told the woman, who was, in effect, the hands everyone went to for business from cradle to grave and everything in between. "She is a willful treasure," Elasade replied, in her usual manner, sparing few words. "Just like you." And, Osrith thought, as she ate the bread, meat and sipped the cooled boiled water, how right she was. A willful treasure described Edra perfectly. After dressing, Osrith was astonished that the day was now up. Though nearly the end of the year, the sun was bright, and lit up the gentle hills to the back of Dunnottar, illuminating their dark greens and golds and purples. Light clouds flitted above her. Were it to last, Osrith thought, and the journey east would be a treat. But the weather was fickle, and changed at will. It was no wonder the Danes and Norse, and the Britons too, believed there was a god who decided the weather based on the effect of it on people. Even Saint Cid had prayed with all his might in a thunderstorm to beg God to spare them from his wrath. They were going today, Senid told her, as she looked in surprised at four-headed horses, and was pleased that the mare, rather than the flighty grey shadow, was going to be hers. "I asked for you to come with me, but Constantine has refused," she told him. Senid nodded. "I am needed here," he replied. "I need you," Osrith replied, needily. Then added, "But as you are here for Constantine, he needs you more." Senid grinned at that, and showed her the provisions he had packed for them. "Tell me about the defense of Dunnottar. Do the Mormons send men?" "They send men, boys. We train them, send them back," Senid replied. Good, thought Osrith. If Constantine wanted a peaceful nation, he needed one with a degree of unity. The meeting of young men to train in the same way with the same purpose would only foster strength of military might. Very, very shrewd. "There is trouble in the West," Senid continued, his usual economy of words abandoned just then. "Refugees, Gaels, come from Dul Riata. The Norse incur more and more into our ancient Gaelish territory." "Diffn Osrith asked, guessing the answer. "Stirring up the Norse, encouraging a land grab, turning a blind eye, rather than actively helping his so-called compatriots in the northern lands. I believe you are to visit Glashku first. Constantine believes that Diffnwell is building a rebellion and attempting to separate Strathclyde from Alba. By not opposing the Norse, he is gifting them land with the promise of future support if he rises against Constantine." That made sense, total sense, and after that, Osrith needed to find out nothing more. Constantine's unity of Alba was threatened. He was sending his Morma for Strathclyde with them for legitimacy, under the cover of a genuine reason that they were going south to debut Bath, so any spies could not fail to find out the truth. And by wooing Anlaf, Constantine would be able to neutralize any threat that may come out of the Western Isles. Then, Constantine sends us, as peaceful travelers, so to speak, to gain witness. She turned to Senid, and took his hand. "That is what I would do. I wish you were coming with us," she added, and the head of Constantine's household guard kissed the top of her head. "I wish to see you well, so you may birth your child safely," he told her. "I have no doubt of your fighting skills, having trained you myself. Will you promise not to use them, and let those bastards fight for you?" He led her to the door of the stables, and pointed across the courtyard to where Constantine was standing, with Eswi, Phelim, and Engus. They were going, that day. They were heading east, and then south, by boat. Osrith was the key Constantine wanted to use to open the box that would unleash Britons of all creeds against the Angles and the Saxons, and even now, at this late hour, do what the Jidders and Pitlanders could not do at Catrach, drive them all back into the sea. 88,888,888. Can you sing, Osrith? Asked Eswi, a few hours into their journey. It was warm, pleasant, and Osrith considered if their mission was all like this, she would not be so displeased. From her horse, Osrith turned at Eswi's words and smiled, shaking her head. If you want the birds to fall out of the trees and the mountains to fall away in horror, I will try, she said, then glanced across to Phelim, who seemed to be doing better than she had on Grey Shadow. Then again, it was probably her. Osrith was not comfortable on horseback, though the dark-coated mare she was riding now was comfortable. No hare no ladder are you then, Angus teased, with a grin, before striking up a song of his own, in Cymric. Phelim joined in, and the two sang in unison. Osrith could not catch all of the words, but the gist was the Battle of Aldclut, where fought Pitland, and she smiled when the men took opposing verses, presumably opposing voices of the sides of the battle, and sung a battle of their own, both smiling at one another. Their kin long ago enemies were now they were trustable allies. They were following the route they had taken before, Constantine, with Tagged, Fergus, and Finoli, fleeing Dunnottar, but moving in an orderly fashion so it looked as if they were merely travelling. How long ago that seemed to her now, and she remembered Finoli trying to teach her and that she had fallen off more times than she could count. It had been Domhnall who had really taught her, at Glen Orchy, but Osrith often wondered what her life would have been like had she been taught to be a lady, learned to manage a household, learned to spin, to organize and dismiss servants, know the jobs of those servants till they could be monitored, have the soft, effective words to praise or chastise. Instead, she had fallen into being a warrior, and had no one to teach her. And when people looked to Osrith for those qualities, they had to look again, for she was blunt and forthright, and spoke her mind. Yet she had learned to be a warrior, which was a career for men, something they developed to be a leader, and teach men their own skills. And she knew she understood strategy. Which is why it felt that Constantine trusted her, respected her a little more than he used to, and that made Osrith feel happy and proud that she was from Alba, and could call Dunnottar her home. Happy that she had found out about her mother at last, and that she might be able to settle as a wife to a Morma, when she returned. Had she really thought that? Osrith asked herself, as Phelim and Engus's sing came to an end and Eswi struck up a gentle song, which undulated like their hills over which they rode. Was she really prepared to settle? It was not a question she could answer just then, but equally, she would not be parted from this child. She had done barely a job with Edra, being absent for most of her life. So no, Constantine would not raise hers and Finan's child. But she may yet consent to marriage as long as the Morma in question expected precisely nothing of her intimately. It began to rain as they passed by Scone, the place where Domhnall had brought the huge red sandstone block from Tara, to mark the place that, ever onwards, the kings of Alba would be crowned on behalf of the three kingdoms. Osrith shuffled her cloak further round her shoulders, fearing to take her hands from the reins to adjust the tie in case she toppled off, and water settled near the collar. She could feel the Morrigan now, flexing her fingers, bristling with satisfaction that Osrith was now within her realm. And the Queen of the Sea beat rain down onto them all as they wound their way across the border of Strathclyde, though little in the scenery or landscape marked any such boundary, and took a road that followed the Clyde River that would take them to Glashcu. Guards were beginning to line the roads at a place where Osrith recognized that the landscape opened out into a glade where trees grew, sparsely, marking an approximate way to the palace. It wasn't much more than Dunnottar, wood knitting with stone to make the formidable fortification which backed onto the river and whose other side lay on a ridge which fell away into a tree-lined glen. It was easy to defend in a siege, and had the advantage, which Domhnall had taken the night they had fled, Finoli taking a sleep Osrith by the hand, that boats could be readied for imminent escape. Angus was slowing up as torches flickered in the deluge, and Osrith shivered as the Strathclyde Morma looked to the ramparts. "Who is without?" came a voice, and Osrith saw that two men had appeared, peering over the ramparts at the little company. Eswi's horse blew through its mouth, steam coming from its lips into a cloud of steam in the rain. Osrith couldn't hear all of the exchange, but it was labored enough to cause a rise in Angus, who was clearly annoyed at being delayed entry to the fortress, and eventually the gates were pushed open so the 4 horses could carry their riders over a small bridge and into the inner courtyard of the palace. "The king is not here," came a voice beside Angus, who has slipped from his mount and was leading his horse into the stable. Eswi and Phelim were taking their horses too, but Osrith was still on her mare, rigid with cold from holding the reins. "Osrith!" Eswi called, turning back to her. But she felt her fingers too cold to move, so she sat still, trying to move her leg, watching as Eswi walked back over to her. "Get off, stupid bastard!" shouted a guard, pulling at the horse's bridle, and Osrith, not expecting it, fell onto the mud and straw. She must have cried out, for beside her were Eswi and Phelim, and she felt Eswi touch her arms and lift her as her eyes closed, an image of Angus beating the guard the last thing she saw until she opened her eyes again, lying as she was in a soft bed. The rain had stopped, the sun was pouring through the window and Osrith was looking out on the following morning. 88,888,888. "You're awake," said a voice on the other side of Osrith. Turning, and expecting Eswi to be there, Osrith threaded a smile on her lips, only to see a man, pale golden hair falling to his waist and a beaming smile on his own. "You don't need to move," the man said, and he brought the chair on which he was sitting closer to her bed. "I am sorry I missed your arrival, Angus punished the guard who pulled you." He looked down Osrith's body over the blanket under which she lay. "I took the precaution of sending my physician to you, in the presence of your guardian. Nothing untoward. He feels rest will do you good, and food, before your journey." My guardian?" Osrith touched her head, feeling a lump near her temple. The young man smiled again, and it seemed to Osrith she knew him, although she could not place where. "The man with the long black hair, bald on top. Swears like a say? Eswi?" Osrith considered. "Perhaps. All Picts look the same to me," he added. "All Gales too." He leaned over and put an arm out for Osrith to hold as she tried to shuffle up the bed, and she gripped it tightly and pulled herself to a semi-sitting position, one hand on her stomach. Had the child grown in the last 2 days? It certainly seemed noticeable to her that she was having a little trouble bending. "Do I know you?" Osrith said, and the young man shook his head. He looked to be about Elfkin's age, and had that bright air of optimism that young people naturally exude when the cruelties of life had not yet been experienced. "No, not yet. But I do hope to get to know you, Osrith," he said, smiling again. A piece of the puzzle dropped into place in Osrith's head and she tried a little test. "Osrith is the name I chose for myself," Osrith told him. "My mother chose me a different name." "Edra," the young man said, at last, after examining her face. "Edra, of Utad," he said. And then Osrith knew, and spoke to him in the Cymric she knew. "King Diffenwyl," she said. "I am pleased to meet you, at last." At her last remark, Diffenwyl laughed. "You have heard so much about me?" he asked. "And where did you learn your Cymric?" "Dunnottar, amongst the Britons," Osrith replied. "Is my pronunciation poor?" Diffenwyl shook his head, his long hair moving as he did so. Then he stared at Osrith for a moment, as if checking she was real, his cornflower blue eyes on hers. "You have a Gaelish accent," Diffenwyl replied. "You can work on that." "Why would I want to work on that?" Osrith asked. "We are simply here to sail from your fortress to Debu Bath." And she did not know whether she was angry, or also amused when Diffenwyl threw back his head and laughed at her. "Is that what that bastard Constantine told you?" he asked, then saw that Osrith was not amused. No, he said, "that is not all you are here for. Constantine ... he, well, has a plan. You are too." "No," shrieked Osrith in her mind, thinking of Constantine's pointed insistence she should marry. The king was old enough to be her own son. "Calm yourself," Diffenwyl cautioned, gently. "He merely wishes your Cymric to be more, shall we say, polished, when you meet Hywel, and I am not marrying him, either," Osrith protested, making to get out of the bed, not caring if she was in her ludicrously long shirt that looked like a short dress, not caring if he had to hunt for her clothes. She was going back to Dunnottar to tell Constantine that someone else could take his letter. And she noticed, beside her, that the letter was waiting. Marry Hywil? Diffenwell laughed again. He is already married, and has grown-up sons. You think Constantine plans to marry you to someone? But already Osrith was trying to get up. Where are my companions? She asked, as Diffenwell tried to shoulder her back to bed. Tell them, but Diffenwell was getting to his feet. Would you like me to fetch Eswi? He asked. Yes, Osrith replied. Then I will. Diffenwell got to the door, a hand on the handle. I am sorry that our first meeting was in such circumstances. I was looking forward to meeting my cousin, and seeing what the last of the line of the Colings looked like for myself. He gestured to the table by the door. Eat, drink, our land produces much bounty, he added. I will get your companions for you. 88,888,888. The milk, sheep, but not vomit-inducing, settled happily in Osrith's stomach as she consumed some of the bread and meat. Apples sat next to plums, which tasted delicious with some of the soft cheese that had been wrapped carefully in linen, food which Osrith normally would not have cared for. He was so unlike what she had expected, Osrith thought. Young, vigorous, perhaps yet unmarried, she had been prepared for a king, the son of Eochaid, riddled through with bitterness about his land and his circumstance, for he must have suffered the sanctions his father had endured with his fall from the throne of Alba, and the death of Greogair. Osrith wanted Diffenwell to return, to come back so she could ask the questions, all the questions, she had for him. Like, who else were her kin? Like, did he know about Wigger? Like, why did she count as the last Coeling, of the line of Coelhen, old King Cole, with a Saxon father when he did not? Why Diffenwell was not being trusted to go to Hywil by Constantine, when it would provide an ideal opportunity for the young man to make a connection with the Welly Cymric, in line with Constantine's wishes. So Osrith's heart began to rise when, after dressing as well as she could, for she would not linger in bed when there was nothing wrong with her, the door opened. She expected Diffenwell to step in, but it was Angus, worry in his eyes, his brows down as he looked at Osrith. Cailin, Angus said softly, though being called a girl was pushing the definition somewhat. How bides ye? I am well, Osrith replied, then asked outright, what is it that we are staying here for, Angus? Diffenwell said I am to stay, I am to learn things that will please King Hywil. Better Cymric? Looking abashed, Angus sat on the chair Diffenwell had just vacated and stroked at his long, orange beard. Aye, he replied. Constantine did think we could use our time profitably. Osrith turned away. And thought like Constantine would think. Ah, no, ye bairn, Angus began, thinking she was crying. But Osrith turned back and got to her feet, a little unsteadily, but up. It's a cover, she told him. He has told Diffenwell that I, as the last of the Coelings, needs to learn about her culture, especially to pass on to the child. Yet, he wants you all to be here, under the premise that you are guarding me. And and you can uncover any plots and rebellions that Diffenwell may be involved in. Angus said nothing for a while, and Osrith sat herself down on the bed. Well? She asked. Am I right? You are right, Angus agreed. Then I wished he would have told me. Osrith snapped. I am sorry, Angus, I am not angry at you. He says he trusts me, he says this is my last work, and how important it is, and then the very thing vital to its success, and he keeps it from me. Do you wonder why? Angus said. He is king, he does not want you to usurp him, now, does he? Osrith stared at him, blankly, running his words through head. Huh? Usurp him? That was ludicrous. He had 2 sons, to start with, and how many kin across in Aryan, many cousins in Pitland. Put your mind to this, Osrith, Angus said, as she sat in silence. Yer worked out his plan. But yer didn't ken his motive. You are the last of Aryan's line, you. He confided you this knowing that a whole kingdom could, potentially, fall behind you in a rebellion campaign. You, who fought your first battle at 12, and, I, a Kalin, a Bean. 2 of his 3 nations could look to you to be queen, a third, dull rioter. If the child you bear has a Gaelish father. Angus shook his head. For a woman of your intellect, your bravery, you didn't see that? And Osrith hadn't. She did. It was true, have a blind spot when it came to the motives of others, and she would never think she could be used as a pawn by others to overthrow Constantine. Me? Queen? Her mind worked this out, and couldn't think of it. Outside a breeze blew up, and she turned. A voice seemed to fill the air outside and enter her mind. The great queen of the Sirord in the world, Nilbrenin, by Digenich Frenhines, Nidinduil und hard day seen off Nidweefel y war. Beriglasful y ed. Cryfark nesel fuinir de ear. Bide por bifinaru a scene anobithio. Osrith jerked her head and looked at Angus. Had he heard it? Had she said it? A queen of the 3 nations, of Alba, mighty and powerful, all would love her, all would despair. She felt herself get up, move to the window, and shout to the Morrigan, he is dead. Tagged. To whom I promised. Me, on whom I let you put a geese. He was taken from me. And I will not be queen of Alba. There, she had said it. The great queen of the Sai could rise high, with the air, swim deep with the waves, and Osrith would not be found going on a bargain to the spirit queen of this country. She looked back to herself, but Osrith found she was not by the window, but was still sitting on the bed. Angus was, however, for he had got to his feet, glancing out of the shutters, down onto the river, which was winding westwards, widening into an estuary into the dispersed into a mist towards a hill of darkening trees. He turned back, and bent his head to Osrith. So he is trusting ye, as a potential threat to him, with something vitally important on a whole other level, the uniting of Cymric and Gael in the repulsion of the Anglo and Saxon. He is willing to risk you travelling to his overt enemy here, in Strathclyde, where you could be used by this genial, outgoing, charismatic king, and yes, he is all you will have seen. The people love him, and he appears not to have any other motive but to disunite Strathclyde from Alba, and have his own independent kingdom. Why do you think Constantine tolerates Diffenwill, tolerated Eochaid, being called king? Stripping him of that title would be a huge incendiary thrown onto an already fermenting population. He stroked his beard again. I am Strathclydian, and even I am opposed, by being Morma. Things are delicate. Understood, Osrith nodded. I will play along. But, tell me, how long do you anticipate we remain? She broke off. She had told Finan she had gone to Alba for a safe birth. She did not want to be birthing a baby in a ship off the coast of Wellies with 3 hairy warriors as midwives. No longer than the next new moon, Angus estimated. That was in about a week. The weather will still be fine enough for sailing. Diffenwill will be able to spend time with you on the pretext of educating you about your family, about Gwythelth, and we can feed back valuable intelligence to Constantine. Osrith made to get up, and Angus held up her hand. She ignored him and he turned his hand to her, instead. And, as I am well, I intend to look around the home that was once my mother's, Osrith decided, and smiled at Angus. Where do you suggest I begin?